Hello everyone, LaFinchy here. Today, we will be exploring a timeline where the Soviet Union scores a resounding victory in the Winter War and absorbs Finland into the communist world. In our timeline, Stalin wished to extend the USSR border across the Karelian Isthmus to provide a buffer zone to safeguard Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, especially as Finland could be leveraged by Germany in a possible eastern invasion. After Finland refused to cede territory, the Winter War began. Despite being outnumbered, the Finnish army held up a fierce resistance, and while the Soviet Union did win the Winter War, they lost more soldiers and resources to it than they had planned. In this timeline, the Soviets launched a much more successful coordinated attack on Finland, reaching Helsinki by late December 1939 and Turku 2 weeks later, causing Finland to capitulate under an interim government run by Otto Wille Kuusinen. It is generally accepted that Stalin sought to outright conquer Finland in the war. Finland was one of the Russian imperial territories that the Bolsheviks had to concede in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, unpopular among many prominent politicians in Soviet Russia like Trotsky. The allocation of Finland under the Soviet sphere of influence in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and creation of Kuusinen's Finnish Democratic Republic also point to a desire to absorb Finland. After the war, the Finnish puppet government would be absorbed as a separate SSR. This also includes the integration of the culturally related Karelian ASSR, like what happened with the Yrjökaupunki government after the war. It is very likely that the Soviets would reassign Eastern Karelia to Russia as a means of securing the Murmansk Railway, justified by ethnic Russians living there. But I decided to take the creative liberty of keeping Karelia intact. Perhaps Kuusinen ensures the security of the line as it is connected to other Finnish train networks, with Arkhangelsk seeing massive development as an alternative route to access Murmansk, as well as developing air infrastructure in the region. The Soviet conquest of Finland would have a slight effect on the trajectory of World War II. During the Winter War, the United Kingdom and France considered a military intervention to protect Finland. However, they were shot down by Sweden and Norway, who didn't want to be dragged into the war. With the situation in Finland becoming more urgent, Sweden and Norway could be persuaded into letting Allied forces move through to Finland, or the UK and France move soldiers through the Baltic Sea themselves. This would, at best, delay Finland's inevitable defeat by a couple days, leaving both countries with less resources to fight against the Axis powers. The conquest of France under Germany would be slightly quicker, with Allied forces in North Africa being put under more pressure. However, Operation Barbarossa would likely see less success against the USSR. Finland was an important asset in the Eastern Front, with the Axis members' efforts in the Continuation War from 1941 to 1944 putting pressure on the Soviet forces in Leningrad to facilitate the Northern German offensive into the city. Without Finland, I doubt that the Nazis would be able to reach Leningrad and, with the Soviets having more manpower from Finland available, would curtail the Moscow and Stalingrad offensives more quickly as well, which could see an earlier end to the Second World War. In this timeline, Sweden would have a larger role in Northern European geopolitics, with Finland being invaded. The island region of Åland had historically been extremely contentious for Sweden and Finland, with Sweden occupying the islands during the Finnish Civil War. The Swedish inhabitants of the island voted to join Sweden. This dispute was brought to the newly formed League of Nations, which decided on Åland remaining Finnish while gaining autonomy in the state where it remains today. In this timeline, the jeopardization of the Finnish state could compel Sweden to send an interventionary force to the Åland Islands to secure the region from Soviet control, likely integrating Åland into the Swedish state on the basis of ethnic self-determination of the Åland Swedes. However, I could see how Sweden would want to incur the ire of the USSR by doing this, and instead opt to remain neutral in the Winter War. But I digress. The relationship between Sweden and the Soviet Union would be further strained by the deportation of most Swedes in Finland to Sweden as perceived enemies of the state by Stalin due to carry on the legacy of centuries of Swedish imperialism in Finland. This would be epitomized by the renaming of the historically Swedish-speaking city of Vaasa, named after the ruling House of Sweden from 1523 to 1654, to Yrjökaupunki, in honor of Yrjö Sirola, a founder of the Finnish Communist Party. Now that Sweden was completely surrounded by Germany and the USSR in World War II, it would likely make it harder for Sweden to maintain its neutrality. Perhaps it could lead more into collaborating with Germany, who they already supplied iron to, possibly going so far as allowing German soldiers to pass through Sweden to aid the Finnish offensive in Operation Barbarossa. If this happens, the Soviet Union could use this to invade Sweden and eventually put the nation under communist rule after the war. In this timeline, however, Sweden will remain neutral in the Second World War. After the war, Scandinavia would become a more contentious political landscape as the Soviets maintained their rule over Finland. This would suddenly compel Sweden to become a founding member of NATO as a means of protection against the USSR, especially as they would likely contest the rule of Åland, considering it a part of the Finnish SSR. Under the Stalinist regime, Finland, like other regions, would experience significant Russification initiatives, especially in Karelia, as it would already have a Russian majority. High-ranking Finnish administrators and intellectuals considered a threat to Stalin, or enemies of the state, would be deported to Siberia and replaced with Russian elites to disparage the Finnic peoples further. However, with the Khrushchev regime, these overt Russification strategies would lessen slightly, with some attempts at conserving Karelian and Vepsian cultures being made in the 60s and 70s. Some people from Finland who were exiled during the Stalinist period may be given a right to return, but coming back to a largely Russian ruling class nonetheless. Of course, many Finns would be adamantly opposed to Soviet rule, and create political resistance movements, with many Finnish separatists and right-wing movements engaging in guerrilla conflict from 1939 all the way to the early 60s. This would also inspire political resistance against the Russian-dominated government, culminating in Finland joining the Singing Revolution from 1987 due to increasing political freedoms in the Soviet Union from Khrushchev and later Gorbachev through the implementation of glasnost and perestroika. The addition of Finland into the Soviet Union would do little to prevent the collapse of the state. After Finland and Karelia declare independence together in 1991, they, like Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, would likely be left with some nuclear weapons, which would create significant tension between Finno-Karelia, or Finland, and Russia, especially as the Kola Peninsula would be cut off from the rest of the country. Due to the government of Finland being extremely anti-Soviet and anti-Russian, I can see Finland joining NATO and later the EU in order to protect against Russian imperialism, especially in the Russian-majority Eastern Karelia. This may also encourage Finland to keep Soviet-era nukes rather than handing them over to Russia. From the 90s, Finland would mirror the state of a lot of the Baltic states in the post-Soviet era. It would generally have a lower quality of life, fertility rate, and smaller economy, especially due to the stagnant Soviet economy of the 70s forward. Much of the city skylines, especially in cities largely destroyed in World War II, would be peppered in the USSR's signature commie block apartments as a cheap and fast method of housing its post-war population. Due to this, Finland proper would likely have a lower population in our timeline, but Karelia might have a higher population of around 1 to 1.5 million, with ethnic Karelians representing around 45 to 60% of its population. Throughout the 21st century, Finland would become more integrated into the greater European landscape through their admission in the European Union. Finno-Karelia would also make moves to curtail or integrate the large Russian minority that would be living in the country through settlement and promotion of Finnic languages. Due to the Soviet mandate of state atheism, Finland would likely be majority or plurality irreligious, with Lutheranism and Orthodoxy competing for second place. Finland would continue to have extremely contentious relations with Russia as the country would pursue aggressive incursions into Georgia and Ukraine, causing Finland to militarize more and invite American forces to construct military bases in their territory. Putin would definitely have interests in acquiring Karelia from Finland under the guise of liberating its Russian civilians from perceived ethnic oppression. But this would be less likely as Finno-Karelia's status as a NATO and EU member could incite conflict with Europe and the US if Russia pursues a special military operation on Finland. In the present day, Finno-Karelia would run as a dual republic, as not to disparage either Finns or Karelians in the state, with it having 3 capital cities to maintain such equality: Helsinki, Viborg, and Gyllingluna, the latter renamed from Petrozavodsk in honor of Edvard Gylling, due to its association to Russian imperialism. Finland would be poorer than in our timeline, comparable to the Baltic states, due to being dragged into the stagnant Soviet economy of the 1970s and 80s, along with the purging of Finnish economic and intellectual elite. However, there would still be a few notable companies in the country, most prominently Nokia. However, most of the economic power of the country would be concentrated in Finland proper, with Karelia remaining much poorer and more politically contentious as a region of Russia's desire. To conclude, a resounding Soviet victory in the Winter War would have seen Finland fall into the Soviet Union as a Karelo-Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic, that would ultimately leave Finland in a poorer state than they are in our timeline. Although this could allow the Karelian people to survive as a demographically significant group with their homeland and empower the Karelians to preserve their culture and self-determination. Whether Finland ultimately leaves Soviet control better or worse off than in our timeline is up for debate. Here is the final product.